Hi, I'm Jo Morley. I'm the head of campaigns at City to Sea. We're an environmental not-for-profit and we run campaigns to prevent plastic pollution. So we're not cleaning beaches, we're really trying to focus on tackling single-use plastic at source. We were really excited to be invited to join the Darwin project, to spend the last 3 months aboard the beautiful Pelican of London, circumnavigating the UK, and throughout the project we've been leading on a plastics research project. So our aims for the project were to understand the abundances, the distribution and the sources of marine plastic around the UK. So really amazing and unique opportunity to visit some of the most remote islands and also the busiest ports to really get a bit of a snapshot to see where plastics are coming from, where they're ending up and how things have been impacted or if they've been impacted by the pandemic. So throughout the project there are 3 main areas that we've been looking at. First of all, macroplastics, so larger pieces of plastics, to understand the distributions, the sources and the quantities of these around the UK, visiting some of the most remote islands and also busiest ports. We've also been looking at microplastics, so not actually in the water column but within the seabed, because we know that most plastics sink and there's been some really interesting research that's been carried out that's actually found twice the volume of microplastics in the sediment in the seafloor. So we've been working with the dive team to collect sediment samples which are then going to be sent back to Southampton University to be analysed. And the third thing that we've been looking at throughout the trip is the infrastructure for waste management across various ports. So wherever we've stopped, we've been carrying out surveys with the harbour master to try and just get a bit of an understanding to see what's possible when ships dock in ports. Are there recycling facilities, especially on remote islands? How do they actually deal with waste? So they're the 3 areas that we've looked at throughout the voyage. So the biggest part of the project has been to undertake beach surveys. So we've been doing transects on every single beach that we've visited as we've travelled on the 3 different legs around the UK. And the other thing that we've been looking at as we've conducted our beach surveys is to get a bit of background information. So we want to understand what's actually happening on that beach, which will kind of enable us to better understand the sources of any marine pollution that we're finding. So we're looking for things like, are there cafes, has there been any development, is there a port nearby, and also what's happening in terms of beach management. So over the 13 weeks that we travelled around the UK, we successfully carried out 47 beach surveys. So we visited 47 beaches in, as I said, some of the most remote locations. We were extremely lucky, and I think that this is really a first of its kind voyage and plastics research project from this aspect. We've been able to visit some of the busiest ports. We've been to Bristol, we've been to Edinburgh, to Leith, up to Glasgow, but we've also been out to St Kilda, to Rockall, and all around the Outer Hebrides. So we've visited 47 beaches. We carried out 54 surveys, so 54 horizontal transects. These are our 100-metre transects, and we carried out 147 vertical transects. And we actually found 6,500 pieces of marine litter, which is pretty sad when you consider how isolated many of these locations were. Works out at just under 1 piece of marine litter per metre squared along the voyage. And interestingly, about 80% of these were plastic, which is broadly what we'd expect to find, but there were also some really interesting findings. So actually only about 10%, just under 10% of the marine litter that we found was single-use plastic. In kind of global data sets that tends to be much higher, between 50 and 60% is usually representative of single-use plastic. So these are the consumer items that we use every day. Of the single-use plastic that we did find, unsurprisingly, bottle lids and plastic bottles were number 1, followed by things like sweetie wrappers, cigarettes, which globally is the most found single-use plastic item, and other things like cutlery, straws, and lovely things like flushed wet wipes and cotton buds were our worst offenders when it came to single use. Fishing gear was probably the biggest shocker for me personally. Globally it tends to make up around 20 to 40% of marine litter, and throughout the voyage on a whole it was about 24%. But across different legs, on the third leg, we actually found about 60% of the marine litter that we were finding was fishing related. And that for me, as a campaigner, kind of predominantly focused on single-use plastic, was really, really shocking to see, particularly in such isolated areas where we actually, one of the dirtiest beaches that we surveyed with the most fishing gear was actually the beach just off where we saw some orca. And there were also beaches we were surveying where we knew that otters were feeding. We've seen the impact that it's had on the seabird populations. You know, some amazing footage, really, really sad footage of the gannets with their, you know, rearing their young with just fishing gear covering their nets. So I think that has probably been the kind of biggest insight, is really seeing that firsthand and the scale of the fishing gear problem, particularly up in the north of Scotland around Orkney and Shetland, where there's a really, you know, a growing industry around the salmon farming. And there was a clear correlation as well between where the salmon farms were and where we were finding huge amounts of fishing gear, so things like rope and nets. A lot of these kind of really tiny pieces of green net, which then does break down into these much smaller fibres, which then break down into plastic fragments. And it was actually plastic fragments, so on their way, these are bigger pieces of plastic, so, you know, may have resembled at one point consumer single-use plastic, or things like fishing buoys, crates. This made up around 45% of what we found across the voyage. And it was really interesting as well, you know, the influence of the wind and the tides on what we were finding. Some beaches that were right next to each other but were facing in different directions had a completely different makeup of what we discovered. So one beach in Shetland was literally covered in these tiny, tiny plastic fragments that had blown up from the strand line and then were just getting gradually broken down by the weather. One surprise was a lack of nurdles. So I don't know if you've seen these before. These are pre-production plastic pellets which often make their way into the oceans as a result of container spills, or actually they're often used apparently in sewage plants to absorb toxins, which is one of the reasons they're so dangerous. So these tiny, tiny little plastic pellets, they are very easily mistaken for food, and when they are in the oceans they also absorb toxins, making them even more harmful to marine life as well. So that's something we don't want to see, and luckily we didn't find very many of those at all. What's been really interesting has been the really distinct findings across the three different legs. The first leg in particular, where we were much more focused in the south coast, which is probably the busiest area we visited along Devon and Dorset, and the south coast beaches. So that's where we obviously found the most single-use plastic. So that was where there were busy food outlets and cafes on beaches. We found a lot of food packaging, unsurprisingly, and that's where also the beaches were being cleaned the most regularly. So it's going to be really interesting to compare the data that we found with other data sets in those areas. The second leg, out in the Outer Hebrides, was the most remote and unsurprisingly the cleanest by far. There were a couple of anomalies. There were some beaches where we found huge amounts of polystyrene, which we think is related to the fishing industry, and also a beach which was next to a pub and lots of cafes, which is the only place we really found any significant single-use plastic up there. And then the third leg, as I said, which was just dominated by fishing gear, with the one exception, which is when we got to Edinburgh. The beaches along Portobello and Leith, just outside the city, were for the first time the only places we really started to find single-use plastic and consumer-related plastic. Lots of cigarettes, again, which is a clear correlation to the bars and the pubs that are along the seafront, and the fact that it's visited by so many people. And the other interesting insight that we found in Edinburgh was just to the west of the main kind of tourist beaches was a sewage works. And it was for the first time on our journey we were finding things like wet wipes, cotton buds and sanitary menstrual products, which all often, unfortunately, do overflow from sewage works or as a result of people flushing them down their toilets. So about 6% of marine litter that we find in the UK is flushed down our loos. So please do remember, only flush the 3 P's, pee, paper and poo, to avoid those problems ending up on our beaches. So as a campaigning organisation, having access to data like this is so important, and especially primary data that's really unique, as I said. So having access to this is going to really help us with our campaign strategy moving forwards. It enables us to know what are the problem items that we can focus on. It also adds weight to any lobbying or government pressure for campaigns that we're working on, and we'll also be sharing a lot of this data with other organisations, particularly around the fishing gear, to identify where they're coming from, and whether there are other campaigning angles that we can apply pressure on for those to support other organisations. For more information and to read the full report, we'll be turning all of this into a full, much more detailed report when we've had time to condense all of the information. Visit the City to Sea website to find out more.